I'm Valerie Pringle, and I think W.O. Mitchell's Who Has Seen the Wind is a great Canadian book. It is considered a classic, the story of this little boy, Brian Sean McMurray O'Connell, as he grows up in this little prairie town in Saskatchewan during the Depression. I mean, you get such a feel for the prairies. I grew up in Ontario as a girl, but you understand and you get more of a sense of place from this book than almost any book I've ever read. Here was the least common denominator of nature, the skeleton requirements simply of land and sky, Saskatchewan Prairie. And then it sort of focuses in like a sort of Google Earth thing into this little house where this little boy, Brian Sean McMurray O'Connell, lives. And, you know, he's starting to explore life. His brother's very sick, his parents are preoccupied, his grandmother's crabby. He goes to try and find the minister to find out about who God is and the meaning of life. And when the minister's busy, he sort of wanders home. And then there's this wonderful section as he's wandering home, this little boy. He looked up to find that the street had stopped. Ahead lay the sudden emptiness of the prairie. For the first time in his 4 years of life, other than on visits to his Uncle Sean's farm, he was on the prairie. He had seen it often from the veranda of his uncle's farmhouse or at the end of a long street, but till now he had never heard it. The hollowing hum of telephone wires along the road, the ring of hidden crickets, the stitching sound of grasshoppers, the sudden relief of a meadowlark's song were deliciously strange to him.
Mitchell wrote about the prairie, and the prairie becomes a character in Who Has Seen the Wind. We follow Brian's story very clearly. Brian coming of age in the prairie reminds me of David Copperfield coming of age in London, reminds me of Duddy Kravitz coming of age and growing in Montreal, of Nomi Nickel coming of age in small town Manitoba. But in all these stories, the landscape is an important character.
It's almost a cliche about how his writing is almost, you know, one of the main characters in his writing is the landscape that he's writing out of. Not only prairie in the sense of wild or foothills mountains as wild landscape, but also in terms of the communities, small foothills towns, small prairie towns.
So much of what he's writing about is this boy sort of searches for meaning in life and death and playing with friends and, you know, the death of a puppy, the death of a dad, what is God? And it sounds heavy, but I mean, there's so many funny bits to it and wonderful characters and people in the town. You get a real feel for what the life was like in the Depression and how tough it was and how people struggled through. Get a real sense of a prairie community and town working together. But also, you know, all the characters ultimately understand that they're alone as well, including the little boy. From the age of 3 and 4, kind of intrinsically understands that he's alone.
W.O. used to always claim that there were 2 major incidents in his life that made him a writer. One was the death of his father when he was only 7, and the other was when he contracted bovine tuberculosis in his wrist. And he had to wear a brace, and he was out of school for almost a full year. And this had been when he was about 12 years old. And he used to go and wander out in the prairie at all times, all seasons. And he said it was that experience of losing his father and realizing that he was mortal, and the experience of being cut off from school and being by himself out on the prairie, he said it turned me inwards on myself, and I communed with myself a lot out there, and it made me an observer of the details and the life of that prairie landscape.
The prairie vastness, the emptiness, provides a kind of hopeful space. His idea is that civilization destroys us. The rules make us worse. They put us into boxes. He is very profoundly about being outside the box. And outside the box is the vast open plain of the prairies where, strangely, people have a very keen sense of morality, and there are better people than they are in the city.
Without hesitation, he crossed the road and out through the hip-deep grass stirring in the steady wind. The grass clung at his legs. Haloed foxtails bowed before him. Looping grasshoppers sprang from hidden places in the grass, clicketing ahead of him to disappear, then lift again. A gopher squeaked questioningly as Brian sat down upon a rock warm to the backs of his thighs. He picked up a pale blue flax flower at his feet, stared long at the stripings in its shallow throat, then looked up to see a dragonfly hanging on shimmering wings directly in front of him. The gopher squeaked again, and he saw it a few yards away, sitting up, watching him from its pulpit hole. A suave-winged hawk chose that moment to slip its shadow over the face of the prairie. I love that line. Slip its shadow over the face of the prairie. And all about him was wind now, a pervasive sighing through great emptiness, as though the prairie itself was breathing in long, gusting breaths, unhampered by the buildings of the town, warm and living against his face and in his hair.
Who's Seen the Wind has an appeal to people who are 3 foot high and people who are 6 foot high. And it's interesting the way in which that book began to be picked up in curriculum in schools across Canada. At first, it was in high schools, but it's been read as early as as early as grade 7. And the analogy has often been made that W.O. is a kind of Mark Twain of Canada, and the way in which Huck Finn appeals to both an adolescent as well as an adult audience. Who Has Seen the Wind seems to have the same appeal, and certainly his what has often been called as a sequel to Who Has Seen the Wind, How I Spent My Summer Holidays, has often been compared to Mark Twain. But it's interesting that he had an instant rapport with kids, and when he was writing Who Has Seen the Wind, he had been reading Jean Piaget, the child psychologist, and he quite consciously used some of the theories behind that to try and capture that child's world. And I think that explains in part the reason why the book appeals to a younger as well as an older audience.
The wind is a major character in this novel, not surprisingly. And the title, Who Has Seen the Wind, is so beautiful. I didn't know where that had come from, but Bill Mitchell puts at the very front of the book the poem by Christina Rossetti that goes, "Who has seen the wind? Neither you nor I. But when the trees bow down their heads, the wind is passing by." And I can hear it now, even here. I mean, what's more beautiful than that through the leaves? But in the prairie, as it's flowing through the grasses and bringing everything to life as if it's animating the world. I mean, you really get a sense of the power of the wind.
The question is, what does he mean by the wind, of course? And the wind is the spirit, the thing that invests the entire world with life, but is invisible at the very same time. In a way, Mitchell is looking forward to our time period. This was written in 47, but most people I know say they're not religious, yet they're spiritual, and this is a profoundly spiritual book.
Then, for the second time that day, he saw a strange boy, one who came from behind him soundlessly, who stood and stared at him with steady gray eyes in the face of a noticeable broadness, with cheekbones circling high under a dark and freckled skin. He saw that the boy's hair, bleached as the dead prairie grass itself, lay across his forehead in an all-round cowlick curling under at its edge. Once new, now indescribably faded, his pants hung open in 2 tears just below the knees. He was barefooted. Brian was not startled. He simply accepted the boy's presence out here as he accepted that of the gopher and the hawk and the dragonfly. "This is the prairie," Brian said. The boy continued to stare at him. "It's your prairie," Brian said, "isn't it?" The boy did not answer him. He turned and walked as silently as he had come out over the prairie. His walk was smooth. After the boy's figure had become just a speck in the distance, Brian looked up into the sky, now filled with a soft expanse of clouds, their higher edges luminous and startling against the blue. They stretched to the prairie's rim. As he stared, the gray underside of one carded out, and through the cloud's softness was revealed a blue well shot through with sunlight. Almost as soon as it had cleared, a whisking of cloud stole over it. For one moment, no wind stirred. A butterfly went pelting past. God, Brian decided, must be very fond of the boy's prairie.
In W.O. Mitchell's Who Has Seen the Wind, there's a lot of description, and I found when I was a young man it made me very impatient. I wanted to get on with the story. I felt as if there wasn't enough story there. And yet now that I'm older, in my mid-50s, it reminds me a lot of my childhood, because there are beautiful descriptions of details such as watching the ants go by. You feel like you're stepping into the child's world and yet informed by having been an adult. I haven't felt so positively childlike for decades.
One of the things when I was rereading this book, I'm thinking, childhood. I mean, their childhood was so free. They wandered around the town. Both Brian and his younger brother, Bobby, just explored and lived their lives. They were shooed out the door by their grandmother in the morning, and they went and lived their lives. I mean, this is something that just doesn't happen anymore in our lives. We overprotect our children. We drive them to school, drive them to classes. So this one wonderful scene where, you know, Brian, who's maybe 6 at his first day of school, has been sent by his father to go and find his little brother Bobby, who may be 4, somewhere in town. He's missing, but nobody's ostensibly concerned. It said, at the moment that Brian stood outside the drugstore, looking up and down the street for his brother's wagon, Bobby was 3 blocks over, on the high station platform, sitting in his red wagon under the broad eave of the station building. The 11:15 train had just come in, and the express agent, Mr. McKellar, with 2 helpers, was in the act of unloading the town's express into a high-wheeled cart. Bobby watched the unloading. He watched the cart being wheeled to the express shed. He watched Mr. Staples shoulder the mail bags and carry them to the light delivery truck that bore the royal coat of arms on its door, signifying that it carried His Majesty's mail. During the summer, the business district had become the scene of Bobby's daily odyssey. A small, red-haired Ulysses, he traveled by red wagon, one knee up, one leg propelling him along as he steered with the tongue in his fat fist. Such a great line, in his fat fist. On his way to the post office, he stops by the pool hall. He watches the men, play pea pool, snooker, and skittles, and spit into the brass spittoons. And then he stops by to see the horses that pull the fire wagon and the garbage truck. For now, he watched the standing fire and garbage wagon horses, his mouth slightly parted and his round and freckled face savoring the smell of horse, hay, and manure. This was the climax of his travels. He felt a hand on his shoulder and looked up to see his brother Brian. Come on home, you're gonna get it. And when he did get home, his mother did eventually tie a clothesline around his waist and keep him in the backyard. But what an image of a prairie boyhood, that you could just go and wander and explore.
It's tempting to think of Who Has Seen the Wind as a kind of sentimental story, a kind of Lassie Come Home, a nostalgia piece, because it's set in a small town on the edge of the fields, on the edge of the prairie. But the reality is, it's quite the opposite. It's quite a brutal, brutal book in its own way, because it faces the realities of life. At the very beginning, we have a baby who is going to die, it seems. They're doing the best they can, but the baby's probably going to die. And the main character, he just kind of shrugs and goes on. He's 4 years old, and his little brother might die. And then subsequently, in the middle of the book, the father dies quite suddenly as well. And there's no softening of it. It's dealt straight up. There's a kind of brutal reality to Who Has Seen the Wind that takes it far, far away from the kind of sentimentality we think it might have.
The hardest thing that Brian has to deal with in this book is the death of his father, and his dad Gerald is this lovely, warm, nurturing character. His mom Maggie is portrayed so well, and the grandmother. I mean, the characters are so beautifully drawn. But after his dad dies, he doesn't really cry, and he's still young, and sometimes it is hard to understand, when you're little, how you respond. But after the funeral, he takes off to the prairie, of course. It says, "The town was just a clotting upon the horizon behind him. When he turned, he could pick out the water tower, the gumdrop dome of Lord Robert's school, the spire of the Catholic Church. All around him the wind was in the grass with a million timeless whisperings. A forever and forever sound it had, forever and for never. Forever and forever the prairie had been, before there was a town, before he had been, or his father, or his father, or his father before him. Forever for the prairie, never for his father, though never again. People were forever born, people forever died, and never were again. Fathers died, and sons were born. The prairie was forever, with its wind whispering through long dead grasses, through the long and endless silence. Winter came, and spring and fall, then summer and winter again. The sun rose and set again, and everything that was once was again, forever and forever. But for man, the prairie whispered, never, never. For Brian's father, never. And as the boy stood with the prairie stretching from him, he knew that things were different now, forever and forever. Forever, the dark well of his mother's loneliness. Forever, the silence that could never end. His mother, the thought of her had filled him with inexplicable tenderness and yearning. She needed him now. He could feel them sliding slowly down his cheek. He could taste the salt of them in the corners of his mouth. There were no catches of breath, simply tears as he stood alone in the silence that stretched from everlasting to everlasting. A meadowlark splintered the stillness. The startling note stayed on in the boy's mind. It sang again. A sudden breathlessness possessed him. Fierce excitement rose in him. The meadowlark sang again. He turned and started for home, where his mother was. Really, so poignant. Even when I read it to myself, it makes me cry. I think what's instructive here, all of us are always thinking, oh, it's just me, or I'm just alone, or no one else has these thoughts. You always hear that about, everything. I didn't think anybody was like this. And I guess reading a book gives you an insight into someone else's, an artist, a writer's mind. And that artist and that writer is giving you an insight into a character so that you can really think, other people worry about these things. Would I ever verbalize this? Would I be like little Brian with his innocent questions about what is God, what is right, what is reality, all those things. And yet as you read them, you can nod and understand because, they're universal.
The God in Who Has Seen the Wind is very much an interesting character. It's almost a primitive, Old Testament a private God, a God who will smite your enemies for you. So the main character, Brian's a child. He imagines God perhaps riding on a vacuum cleaner, but he as well wants God to strike down his enemies, and God plays along. The God in his imagination says, yes, I will give them quite a smack. And it was delightful to read this interpretation, this old-fashioned interpretation of God, not as God as being someone just, but God as being someone on your side, like your older brother.
One of the things I love about the book is the sense of community and how, Brian learns who that is and who his family are and how important they are, but always the sense that he's alone and he's trying to figure out his place in the world and the meaning of life and the meaning of God. And, there are great lines in here. He was alone, as utterly alone as it's possible to be, only upon the prairie. And at the end of the book, Brian's around 13, his grandmother has just died, a great character. Not that this book is all death, but of course it is about cycles of life. And he passes his school principal and he talks about, what's on his mind, and the teacher says to him, really, I think you're growing up. And Brian's thinking, yes, someday I will get it. Someday I will be satisfied. I'll understand.
And when I hear those last pages, when I reread them or I hear them read, I'm profoundly moved by them. And it's interesting because that last closing sequence of Who Has Seen the Wind was one that W.O. fought with his American editors to keep in the book. They felt that it was a downer as an ending. And he dug in, hung in there. But that's one of the first things that comes to my mind, is that very rich poetic prose, which is built on the rhythms in part of Ecclesiastes that undershoot that vision he has of the prairie.
And then W.O. Mitchell goes from Brian and his thoughts, and once again to end the book sort of pulls back as we Google Earth in reverse, and just finishes the book with, "A year is done, another comes and it is done. Where spindling poplars lift their dusty leaves and wild sunflowers stare, the gravestones stand among the prairie grasses. Over them a rapt and endless silence lies. This soil is rich. Here to the west a small dog's skeleton lies, its rib bones clutching emptiness. Crawling in and out of the jawbone's teeth, an ant casts about. It disappears into an eye socket, reappears to begin a long pilgrimage down the backbone spools. The wind turns in silent frenzy upon itself, whirling into a smoking funnel, breathing up topsoil and tumbleweed skeletons to carry them on its spinning way over the prairie, out and out to the far line of the sky." And that's how it ends, in this wild open prairie to the horizon, with everything animated by the wind.